Karoline Leavitt, mocked by famous pianist. Then she played and silenced the world. They say live performances are where true character is revealed, but no one expected a political figure to be dragged onto the stage not by invitation, but by humiliation. It all began with laughter, not the polite kind, the cruel kind, the sharp-edged kind that spreads through a room like fire through dry grass. At the Kennedy Center's glittering charity gala, amid champagne flutes and murmurs about cabinet reshuffles, something unforgettable happened. The audience had just finished clapping for the opening remarks when Viktor Kunetsov, world-renowned pianist, beloved cultural ambassador, and unforgiving perfectionist, stepped up to the microphone. Known for his icy poise and biting honesty, he didn't begin with music. He began with mockery. Without naming names but making his target crystal clear, he pointed toward the VIP section and said, "Too many people now believe that politics can do what art does. But art is not a soundbite. It is not a campaign slogan. It is truth without motive." The room buzzed. He paused, letting silence do the work of shame. Some of you believe that being seen near culture is the same as understanding it. Let me ask, have you ever created something that didn't serve power? And then he did name names. Karoline Leavitt, you're here tonight, yes? Her name sliced through the hall like broken glass. Heads turned. She stood there in a simple navy dress, not expecting to be anyone's target. She gave a small nod. Then I invite you, Viktor continued, to prove that you respect beauty beyond politics. In 6 weeks, I will perform at the International Music Festival in San Francisco. I challenge you to do the same. Step onto the stage and play, not for votes, but for soul. A few in the crowd laughed, assuming it was a joke. Others pulled out their phones. The challenge had been issued. Karoline said nothing, not then. She didn't need to, because while the audience whispered and Viktor turned back to his piano to launch into a thunderous Rachmaninoff, Karoline Leavitt walked silently out of the concert hall, but not in defeat, in calculation. The kind of exit made not by someone escaping embarrassment, but preparing for war. The headlines broke within the hour. The video went viral before she'd even reached her car. Talk shows had a field day. White House press secretary challenged to play piano. Has she even seen one? Comment sections were ruthless. She probably thinks Chopin is a salad, friends texted. Aides panicked. Her mother called twice. The White House communications director wanted to issue a carefully worded statement. But Karoline wasn't interested in spin. She'd spent her entire career being underestimated. Too young, too sharp, too polished, and every time she proved them wrong. She opened the X app, stared at the blinking cursor, and typed, "Challenge accepted. I'll bring the music. You bring the humility." She hit send. The internet exploded. Again. If Viktor thought she'd quietly retreat to her podium, he was wrong, because Karoline Leavitt had a secret no one in that concert hall knew. Not the reporters, not the donors, not even the president's closest advisors. She had once been a pianist, a promising one. Years ago, in a small New Hampshire town, she had studied under a teacher whose name she hadn't spoken aloud in over a decade. That teacher was Russian, brilliant, demanding, forgotten, and, as Karoline would soon learn, connected to Viktor in ways neither of them yet understood. Inside the White House, advisors scrambled to contain the narrative. "This is a distraction," one said, pacing. "You're turning the press office into a circus," said another. "Just say it was a misunderstanding," someone suggested. But Karoline remained silent, scrolling through old contacts on her phone, until she stopped at a name, Petrova. She hadn't seen the woman since she was 16, but something about the way Viktor had thrown down that challenge had pulled at her, woken up a part of herself that had gone quiet the day she traded Chopin for campaign speeches. She tapped the screen. The phone rang and rang. Then a voice, tired, Russian, familiar. "Who is calling at this hour?" Karoline swallowed. "It's Karoline Leavitt. I used to be your student." In Atkinson, there was a pause. Then, The girl who hated metronomes and asked too many questions. Karoline smiled, even as her hands trembled. That's me. I've been challenged to play at the International Music Festival. I need your help. Another pause. Then, tomorrow, 9 a.m. Bring tea, lemon, no milk, and don't be late. She ended the call. Her phone lit up again with media requests, editorials, alerts, mockery. But this time, she didn't feel alone. The world thought they'd seen a press secretary get shamed on stage. What they didn't know was that Karoline Leavitt had already started preparing her encore. She hadn't seen the house in over 15 years. It looked smaller now, tucked between two narrow brick buildings, almost like it was hiding from time itself. The porch sagged slightly. The shutters were permanently half-closed, and the brass number on the door was missing its final digit. But Karoline Leavitt remembered every detail: the scent of lemon polish on old wood floors, the chipped ceramic lamp in the foyer, shaped like a swan, the metronome that ticked like a judgmental heartbeat. She took a breath and knocked. The door creaked open almost immediately, as if the woman inside had been expecting her to arrive early. Irina Petrova stood in the doorway, hunched but formidable, wrapped in a thick cardigan despite the DC humidity. Her eyes, however, had not aged a day. They were still that piercing glacial blue, eyes that once made a 10-year-old Karoline weep silently over a missed note. "You're late," she said, though it was only 8:59. "And where is the tea?" Karoline held up a brown paper bag. "Lemon, no milk, just like you asked." Petrova snatched it without another word, turned on her heel and walked inside. The apartment was a small, cluttered museum of forgotten genius. Sheet music piled like snowdrifts on every surface. Old photographs in black frames leaned against bookshelves, one of Petrova shaking hands with a conductor in Moscow, another of her much younger self performing in a grand hall. In the center of the room stood a small grand piano, its ebony surface immaculate despite the surrounding chaos. "Sit," Petrova said, pointing to the bench. Karoline obeyed. The piano felt colder than she remembered. "Play," the old woman commanded, already pouring tea with slow, deliberate movements. "Anything." Karoline's hands hovered over the keys. Then she began, tentatively, playing the only piece her fingers still remembered by muscle memory: Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. But the notes felt stale, detached. Her fingers stumbled halfway through a phrase and she stopped, embarrassed. I'm out of practice," she muttered. Petrova sipped her tea. "You play like someone who hasn't lived since the last note. All technique, no soul." Karoline sat there in silence, her hands shaking slightly on her lap. Petrova watched her, then slowly stood, her knees cracking as she walked to the piano. She nudged Karoline aside without asking and sat down. Then, with fingers still slender but now veined with age, she began to play the same piece. But this time, the music didn't just fill the room, it took it over. Every note carried weight. Every pause felt like a heartbeat suspended. Karoline stared, transfixed, as her old teacher turned simple keystrokes into a revelation. When she finished, Petrova looked over. "Now you see," she said, voice low, "music is not what you play. It is what you reveal." Then came the assignment. Petrova handed her a worn stack of yellowed sheet music, the top page labeled in Cyrillic. The title, she explained, translated to "The Thaw of Winter." A little-known composition from Petrova's own Moscow teacher, it had never been published, never played in a concert. "This piece," she said, "cannot be played with ambition, only with truth." Karoline looked down at the complicated arrangement of notes, arpeggios swirling like storms across the page. "How long will it take to learn?" she asked. Petrova didn't answer immediately. She just poured more tea. "That depends," she said finally, "on how much of yourself you're willing to remember." From that night forward, her life was split in two. By day, Karoline ran the White House press operation, briefings, spin control, diplomatic prep, managing egos, her own included. But after hours, she vanished into a quiet conference room on the second floor of the West Wing, where a newly installed Steinway grand piano waited in secrecy. Her staff thought she was decompressing, writing, maybe recording statements. Only her closest aide knew the truth, that she was preparing for a challenge no press secretary had ever accepted. Every night at midnight, Petrova would arrive, wrapped in a long black coat, walking past Secret Service agents who never asked questions. They would rehearse until 2 a.m., sometimes later. Petrova demanded everything. Again, she would bark if a single note was soft. "You're not breaking ice, you're tiptoeing on it." "Start over," she'd insist when Karoline got too mechanical. "This is the thaw, not a funeral march." Some nights Karoline left in tears, but she always came back. The pain in her wrists grew sharper. The skin on her fingertips began to split. Petrova simply handed her ointment and said, "You want to feel the thaw? Then freeze first." And through the pain, something began to shift. Karoline stopped thinking about the crowd that would be watching. She stopped thinking about Viktor Kuznetsov. She even stopped thinking about the political storm she'd caused. Instead, she thought about her childhood, the afternoons after school in Atkinson, New Hampshire, her mother waiting in the car, the sound of Petrova's voice floating out of that living room as a metronome kept time in the corner. And then came the night Petrova asked her the question that broke everything open. "Why did you quit?" Karolina didn't answer at first. She tried to play through it, but the keys blurred under her vision. "Because I didn't think it mattered," she finally said. "Because politics felt more real, more useful. I thought this," she tapped the piano, "was beautiful, but useless." Petrova didn't scold her. She simply said, "Then your performance will be useless, unless you find the part of you that believed in beauty without needing it to win something." The next day, Karoline didn't return to the White House until nearly noon. She'd been in her Arlington apartment, alone, playing through the thaw again and again until her neighbors complained. When she did arrive, her staff whispered behind doors, her schedule was chaos, and media headlines were still calling her performance idea a delusional vanity stunt. She didn't care, because in that rehearsal room, in that apartment, on that battered bench beside a woman who had once sacrificed her entire career for a single child's lesson, Karoline Leavitt wasn't preparing to prove anyone wrong. She was preparing to remember who she used to be. By the second week, the pain became routine. Karoline no longer flinched when her fingers bled. She stopped complaining when Petrova pushed her past midnight, demanding she play the same 4 measures over and over until the notes came not from memory, but from something deeper, older, like the ache of a first heartbreak remembered decades too late. Her world had become divided into 2 realms, one governed by politics, precision, and power, the other by discipline, emotion, and surrender. It was in this strange duality that she lived now, press secretary by day, relentless student of forgotten beauty by night. The White House staff had started whispering. They didn't know the full story, only that Karoline had grown different, more focused, more distant. Some said obsessed. She missed 2 internal meetings in 1 week, a rarity. She delayed a briefing by 15 minutes to wrap up a silent practice session alone in meeting room B. Her aides noticed the swelling around her knuckles, the red lines creeping up from her cuticles like angry vines. Even her voice changed slightly during press briefings, less clipped, less tactical. It carried a softness now, not weakness, but weight. The press interpreted it as calm authority. They didn't realize it was exhaustion and something else, sincerity. That night, as she arrived at Petrova's apartment for their off-site practice, the door was already ajar. She stepped in and found the old woman at the window, staring out over the quiet street. On the piano was a small black and white photograph, Viktor Kuznetsov, age 10, standing next to a young, vibrant Petrova, both smiling with restrained pride. Karoline studied it without speaking. "He was my first real student," Petrova said, without turning. "The kind who plays as if born knowing, but he never asked why the music mattered. He only wanted to master it." Karoline sat beside her, the silence stretching comfortably between them. Finally she asked, Why did you never reach out to him?" Petrova's fingers, twisted slightly with age, gripped the window frame. "Because I was a ghost by the time I could, and ghosts have no business visiting the living." The next morning, a ripple passed through Washington. Viktor Kuznetsov had responded publicly for the first time since his challenge at the Kennedy Center. A carefully worded post dripping with irony. "Miss Leavitt's courage is admirable, if not her judgment. But the stage is open to all who love music. Prepare well. The world will be watching." Attached was a formal invitation, an updated lineup for the International Music Festival. Kuznetsov would be closing the first night. Leavitt would be opening the second. The political world roared. Media outlets scrambled. One tabloid ran a split image of Karoline holding a microphone next to Viktor seated at a Steinway, the headline reading, "Politics versus Perfection." Editorials accused her of narcissism, delusion, reckless distraction from state duties. "She's turning the White House into a conservatory," one pundit sneered. Her advisors begged her to walk it back. "Just say you're honoring the invitation symbolically," they pleaded. "Release a pre-recorded segment. Don't do it live. Don't stake your reputation on this." But Karoline didn't flinch. She printed the invitation and taped it to the wall above the piano. Each night she stared at it before placing her fingers on the keys. She played not for applause, not even for redemption. She played because something had shifted inside her, something she couldn't explain in any statement or soundbite. It was as if the thaw of winter had started inside her too, cracking through years of calculated ambition to uncover the girl who once dreamed of Carnegie Hall. Petrova watched this transformation with silent approval. Her lessons grew less rigid, more instinctual. She began telling stories of Moscow in the snow, of smuggling band sheet music beneath her coat, of playing on pianos with half the strings broken. One night, after Karoline finally completed the middle passage of The Thaw of Winter without hesitation, Petrova handed her a small red brooch. "This," she said, "I wore during my final concert in Russia before they took my stage away. Wear it when you perform, so I can stand with you once more." Meanwhile, a different kind of preparation was unfolding in a Brooklyn brownstone. Lily Tran, senior journalist at Classical Culture, sat hunched over her laptop with bloodshot eyes and a pile of empty teacups around her. Her editor had demanded a takedown piece 2 days ago. "This press secretary piano thing is a joke. Just say so, get clicks, and move on," he said. But Lily had a rule: never write what you don't believe. And something about Karoline's stoic silence, her refusal to explain herself, her late-night Twitter post that read only, "Some truths can't be spun. Some are played." It gnawed at her. She dug through archives, old competition results, small-town newspaper clippings. She finally found it, a 2001 article from Atkinson, New Hampshire, about a local recital featuring a 10-year-old prodigy, Karoline Leavitt, trained by Russian maestro Irina Petrova. That name sent Lily down a rabbit hole. Irina Petrova, once the pride of the Moscow Conservatory, then vanished. She wasn't just a piano teacher, she was legend in exile. Lily booked a ticket to DC before her editor could argue. 3 days later, under the cover of night, Lily stood in the alley behind the West Wing, heart pounding, microphone off, press badge tucked away. She had mapped out the staff entry schedule, studied guard rotations, found a service entrance left unsecured after 10 p.m. She wasn't proud of it, but journalism demanded more than access. It demanded truth. From the hallway, she heard music, halting, careful, but undeniably evocative. She followed it like a hound chasing scent. At the edge of a half-closed door, she saw it. Karoline Leavitt, head bowed, fingers trembling slightly, seated at a gleaming black piano. The piece was unfamiliar, minor and mournful, and standing beside her, there was no mistaking it, was Petrova. Her hand lightly touched Karoline's shoulder as she guided a difficult phrase. "Less fear," the old woman said softly, "more memory." Lily didn't breathe. She recorded only 6 seconds before her hand dropped to her side. This wasn't a gimmick. This wasn't a politician chasing applause. This was something else entirely, something real. And for the first time in years, Lily Tran knew she wouldn't be writing a takedown. She'd be writing a story, a real one the world didn't expect, but needed to hear. By the time the festival was 1 week away, the pressure had become almost mythic. Inside the White House, Karoline Leavitt's every move was scrutinized, not just by political strategists, but by music critics, culture bloggers, and late-night comedians who joked about her piano rehearsals as if they were punchlines. "What's next?" one quipped on national television. Karoline drops the next mixtape from the Situation Room. But the real tension wasn't on the airwaves. It simmered behind closed doors in senior staff meetings, in whispered hallway conversations, in increasingly tense memos that used phrases like national distraction and brand risk. Her advisors had reached their limit. David, the president's senior policy advisor, paced during their meeting, gesturing toward a wall-mounted screen displaying a live sentiment tracker. This is spiraling. Approval ratings dipped again, not because of policy, not because of any crisis, but because of a piano. Sophia, her communication strategist, tried to inject calm. People are confused. They don't know what's real anymore. Is this performance political theater? Is it personal? Or is it some kind of rebellion? Karoline didn't flinch. She sat at the head of the table, fingers laced together, her back straight. "It's not a rebellion," she said. "It's a reckoning." The room went still. "No one questioned Victor when he turned the Kennedy Center into a soapbox to insult me publicly," she continued. "No one called him a distraction. They called him an artist. But when I answer, sincerely, with effort, with training, suddenly I'm unstable?" She stood, the room quieting further. "This isn't about me proving I'm a better pianist than him. That was never the point. The point is that I'm allowed to remember who I was before I became this title. I'm allowed to want more than strategy and optics, and if I fail publicly, so be it. But I'll fail doing something that matters, to me." Silence. Then Laura, her closest friend and outside advisor, stepped forward. "You're serious about this, dead serious." Karoline nodded. "Then," Laura said slowly, "you need to control the narrative. Don't hide from it. Embrace it. Let people see your work, not your defenses." Karoline glanced toward her aide. "Draft a post. No theatrics. Just honesty." That evening, a simple message appeared across her official channels. "I studied piano as a kid in New Hampshire. I gave it up for politics. Now I'm returning to it, not for applause, but for truth. I'll be on stage at the festival. No promises, except that I'll give it everything I've got." The response was electric. It went viral within minutes. Some mocked it, of course, but others were moved. Pianists, musicians, old teachers, former students. They shared stories of what they had left behind and what they still hoped to reclaim. Suddenly, Karoline's performance wasn't just her story. It became everyone's story. But that night, during practice, her body betrayed her. After hours at the keyboard, Karoline's right wrist spasmed painfully and refused to bend properly. She dropped into the piano bench with a wince. "It's nothing," she told Petrova. "Just overuse." But Petrova had seen this before. She unwrapped Karoline's wrist, pressed gently, and frowned. "You won't play with this tomorrow, maybe not for days." Karoline was silent. The fear came fast and sharp. All these weeks, all this pain. And now, this? "So what?" she said bitterly. "I back out?" "After all this?" Petrova shook her head. "You have another hand, and I have mine." Karoline stared, confused. "You mean a duet?" "No," Petrova said firmly. "A lesson. You play the left, I play the right. You learn the piece without your fingers, you learn it with your mind and your heart. And when your hand heals, the music will already live inside you." So began a new form of rehearsal. By day, Karoline conducted business one-handed, signing documents with her left, typing carefully, speaking into recorders instead of writing notes. At night, Petrova sat beside her on the bench, playing the right-hand parts while Karoline filled in the left. It was maddening at first, unnatural, but soon something strange began to happen. She started hearing the piece differently. She could anticipate shifts in tone, in rhythm, in phrasing, not by logic, but by instinct. And in those moments, the music stopped being an obligation. It became a conversation. Lily Tran, meanwhile, had become a shadow presence in Karoline's world. Granted exclusive access in exchange for silence, she watched everything, took notes, recorded audio, but never video, asked questions only when Karoline had finished each session. She noticed how Petrova never complimented her student directly, but how she'd smile quietly when Karoline nailed a difficult progression. She noticed how Karoline never bragged, never once sought reassurance, even as her hands bled. And Lily understood this wasn't performance prep. It was a reckoning with her own story. But the calm shattered when Lily arranged a final interview with Viktor Kuznetsov in San Francisco just days before the festival. He was cordial, as always, sipping espresso in a boutique cafe near the concert hall. But when Lily mentioned Petrova's name, his demeanor changed. The charm fell away. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, his voice taut. Lily held her gaze. "From Karoline. She's been training with her. She's been learning the thaw of winter." For a moment, Viktor said nothing. Then he exhaled, almost like a wounded animal. "I searched for that woman for decades," he muttered. "I thought she abandoned me." He stood abruptly and left money on the table. "Tell her I'll see her soon, on stage, and tell her the thaw is mine. She taught it to me first." Lily called Karoline immediately, but it was Petrova who answered the phone. "He knows," Lily said. "He's going to use it. He's going to try to own it." Petrova's voice didn't tremble. "He can try, but it's not his piece, not entirely. It belongs to both of them now." That night, Karoline sat at the piano alone. Her wrists still ached. Her nerves hummed with fear, but her left hand moved with fluidity now. It knew the story, and her right hand, it would return. It had to. Because in just days, she wouldn't just play. She would face her past, her rival, and the teacher who once sacrificed everything for her freedom. And if she was to fall on stage, she would fall playing her truth. Note by note, the morning of the performance arrived not with thunder or fanfare, but with a quiet weight. The air in San Francisco was sharp with early fog, curling in off the bay and coiling around the glass and stone of Davies Symphony Hall. Inside, the building buzzed with pre-concert electricity. Cables were checked and double-checked, pianos tuned to perfection, programs laid out on every velvet seat. Journalists had already begun to crowd the press pit, gossiping in low tones not about Beethoven or Debussy, but about one unlikely name, Karoline Leavitt. Her name was everywhere, not as a footnote, not as a novelty, but as the central question of the night. Would she rise, or would she unravel? Backstage, Karoline sat in silence, dressed in a simple black gown, hair pinned back, no jewelry except for a ruby brooch gifted by her teacher, the same one Petrova had once worn during her final concert in Moscow. Her hands rested on her knees, palms open, fingers still bearing the faint traces of healed blisters and calluses. Beside her, on the bench, was a pocket watch, small, tarnished, inscribed in Cyrillic. It had belonged to Viktor Kuznetsov's grandfather. Petrova had pressed it into her hand the night before, saying only, "He'll understand when he sees this." She hadn't spoken much that day, not to Lily, who hovered quietly, notebook in hand, not to Laura, who flew in from DC just to support her from the second row, not even to Petrova, who remained in the wings, her sharp eyes watching every detail, as if she could transmit calm through sheer presence. The world outside her dressing room had become irrelevant. Her pulse didn't race. Her breath stayed steady. She wasn't calm exactly, but resolved. This was no longer about pride or reputation. This was about seeing it through. From the other side of the stage, Viktor Kunetsov's performance thundered into its final piece. He had chosen a brutal program, Rachmaninoff's Etudes, a sliver of Stravinsky, and finally, a surprise addition not listed in the printed program, the Thaw of Winter. The audience stirred with anticipation. Music critics raised their eyebrows. A quiet tension rolled through the hall. This was no coincidence. It was a declaration. Viktor played like a storm breaking over ice. His hands moved with supernatural precision. Every note was articulated, every dynamic perfectly balanced. The piece under his fingers became a display of dazzling control, fast, powerful, unflinchingly cold. There was no hesitation, no cracks in his tempo, no vulnerability. When he ended, there was a pause, a breathless stretch of silence, then applause, thundering, immediate, sustained. He bowed sharply and exited the stage without looking back. But as he reached the wings, his gaze met Karoline's. For a second, both stood still, eyes locked. Then she stepped forward, not to challenge, not to confront, but to place the watch gently atop the piano lid. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Viktor saw it and faltered. The flicker in his expression, surprise, recognition, something else, was fleeting, but it was real. The hall dimmed again. Silence fell. Karoline walked out alone, the stage lights rising slowly around her. The audience leaned forward, phones rose, but this time not everyone recorded. Some watched, some listened, because whatever they had come to see, a political spectacle, a public stumble, was now tempered by something more complicated. She didn't look like someone about to humiliate herself. She looked like someone who had already fought her war and won something, even if only privately. She sat, adjusted the bench, glanced at the pocket watch, then placed her fingers on the keys, and began. It wasn't perfect, not even close. There were slips in timing, one audible error in the opening passage, a stutter in the left hand during a particularly difficult transition. But none of it mattered, because from the first note, Karoline told a story, one that unfolded not through virtuosic technique, but through heart-wrenching honesty. Where Viktor's interpretation had been flawless winter, hers was raw thaw, hesitant at first, like warmth arriving in slow pulses. Her playing wasn't grandiose, it was intimate, personal. You could hear the long nights in D.C., the aching wrists, the self-doubt stitched between notes. The melody wept and recovered. It stumbled and soared, and somewhere halfway through something extraordinary happened. The audience stopped breathing. They weren't just witnessing a politician attempt music. They were watching someone remember herself, right there on the stage. As the final chord resonated, she held it, longer than written, letting the sound bloom and fade like the very last frost. Then silence. Not a single person clapped. Not yet. They simply sat in awe. Then Laura stood, clapped once, then again. Others followed, until the entire hall was on its feet. But the story didn't end there. Backstage, amid congratulations and chaos, Petrova stepped forward, her frail frame more upright than usual. "Encore," she said simply. Karoline blinked. "I didn't prepare one." Viktor, who had lingered behind, interjected. "Neither did I." Petrova's smile was faint but firm. "Then make one. Together." The room froze. They hadn't rehearsed as a duo. They hadn't even played the piece side by side. But the look that passed between them, former rivals, former strangers bound by one woman, carried no hesitation, only clarity. They walked out together, 2 seats at one piano, and began again. This time, the thaw of winter became something else, something greater than either could have played alone. Viktor carried the structure, the icy brilliance. Karoline brought the soul, the fire underneath. They adapted to each other's pace, learned each other's breath, and spoke together in the only language both fully understood, music. By the final note, there were tears. Petrova's, visible even in the wings. Lily's, scribbled into her notebook mid-sentence. Laura's, hidden behind her phone. The audience wept and rose again, not just for the performance, but for the story, for what it meant. Later, when they returned backstage, Petrova gave them her final gift, a leather folder containing a lost Rachmaninoff manuscript. "For my funeral," she said softly. "You'll play it. Together, you'll tell one more story." Victor nodded, his posture no longer arrogant, but reverent. Karoline placed a hand on her teacher's shoulder. That night, as the crowds poured out into San Francisco streets, the narrative had changed. No longer was this about a press secretary out of her depth. It was about rediscovery, legacy, reconnection, and it was just the beginning.